Spoiler alert, you're going to see a bunch of bosses dying really quickly from how strong this build is. Hey guys, in today's video I'm going to be covering the best build of 2024. This is basically an updated version of a build I made 2 years ago with some tweaks and adjustments due to all of the changes that have happened since then, so let's dive into it. Starting off with the weapon, the best choice to use is the Iron Greatsword. If you don't have this, using any greatsword would be best, due to their balance in weight, stat requirement and damage, and I'll mention why using the Blasphemous Blade isn't a good option, because I know when I get further into the build, the entire comments section will light up with comments like, why would you not use the Blasphemous Blade and such forth, so don't worry, I'll explain that. Anyways, when it comes to the Iron Greatsword, or any greatsword that you choose, you're going to want to make sure you have the bleed affinity on it, so we can proc bleed build-ups for tons of damage, and this build isn't focused on just bleed only, it's basically a hybrid for if one area fails in a fight, you can switch over to the other and still do similar amounts of damage, just very versatile. So the Ash of War on it is going to matter quite a bit, because it's what allows us to do a full combo with a ton of burst damage. You have two options here, either repeating thrust, or its counterpart blood tax that consumes twice the amount of mana, but it also heals you for every hit of the attack that lands. Just comes down to personal preference. Now since the greatsword comes with 101 bleed build-up, and repeating thrust makes your character hit 4 times in a quick succession, you can usually proc a blood loss with one use of the Ash of War, or one use of the Ash of War and a basic attack. It's almost guaranteed to proc on most enemies and bosses in the game. So right there is easily a big chunk of damage that can be consistently pulled off in almost every fight. To make this even better, I combo the White Mask and the Lord of Blood's Exaltation Talisman to increase my damage by 30% for 20 seconds, after a blood loss procs. There's not too much to the sword other than, hack and slash at guys until they bleed, or use the Ash of War to make quick work of people. So with that covered, let's move on to the really powerful stuff. First off, we're going to need the Giant's Seal. If you can get your hands on 2 of them, great. If not, 1 will do. Each seal increases the damage of giant fire incantations by 20%, so with 2 of them, you get a 40% damage boost, hence why having 2 of them is great. The only 2 incantations we are going to need is, Flame of the Fell God, and Giant's Flame Take Thee. These 2 incantations can completely nuke bosses, and let you run through the game without ever being stuck somewhere. And just like the Great Sword, there are a couple of things helping this out, like, the Fire Scorpion Charm, increasing all fire damage by 10%, but making us take 10% increased damage as well, and the armor I use covers us for this, so we're good. And we're also using Phlox Canvas to add another 8% increased damage to all of our incantations. If you proc a bleed build up and then switch to using the incantations, you can also get another 30% damage buff due to the bleed prop. That's a little bit more work, and I made this build to be extremely effective, easy to use, and to fit my lazy playstyle. So don't worry about using a ton of buffs, it's not needed, but if you wanted to, sure, you could get more damage and be fully overkill. Getting back to the incantations, I only use these on either really strong guys that I come across here and there, and not really on the average or basic enemies you find around every corner. The incantations just do way too much damage, and they cost a decent amount of mana, so no point in wasting any when our sword can do the same thing for free. The combo I use with incantations is by first throwing out Flame of the Fell God. It moves really slowly, so this gives me a lot of time to either create some space from the boss, or to get into a more open area to make the fight easier. I'll then follow up with a fully charged Giant's Flame Take Thee, before spamming them out as fast as possible, just erasing whoever's health bar. You don't need to constantly do this combo, you could easily just spam Giant's Flame Take Thee, but this gives you the highest amount of burst damage. So if a boss has an annoying second phase or something, you could do this right before he enters it, and try to melt him quickly. You can see this build is heavily centered around faith and fire damage, and most of you are probably thinking, the Blasphemous Blade would be the pick for a weapon. Generally it would be, but the only issue I had with it is when you do fight someone that is heavily resistant to fire attacks, like Mog, you literally do close to no damage, and the fight takes an eternity. Using a great sword with the bleed setup placed on it, completely covers you for fights against fire-resistant enemies. That is the only reason I didn't choose the Blasphemous, because I hate being put in situations where I do no damage, and this fixes that. If you want to get some extra damage all around, there's only one buff I use, and that's the Flask of Wondrous Physic. Only tears wanted, and I said wanted and not needed, because you don't need it for the build to work, but it helps out so much, especially with how easy this is to use. The tiers are, the Flame Shrouding tier, increasing fire damage by 20% for 3 minutes, and the Strength Crystal Knot, increasing strength by 10 levels for 3 minutes as well. The extra strength levels definitely help since our greatsword scales with strength, and we barely have any. I'll get into the stats soon. I just want to mention the armor and one more useful thing to this setup. So for the armor, I went with, as you know, the white mask for my helmet to get a damage buff, and then the entire Knight's Cavalry set for its looks, and the fact it has a pretty good armor rating to go with it, and help reduce the negative effect from the Fire Scorpion charm. Oh, and the last talisman I use is the Great Jar's Arsenal. It saves quite a few levels in endurance with the sword and armor being so heavy, and we're also really tight when it comes to levels, so this one is needed. Now the last thing that'll help this build out, well I guess it would help out with every build, but that's the Dung Eater summoning. He is stupid strong with this setup. He's heavily aggressive, so bosses will usually focus on him a lot more than you, giving you time to cast incantations and whatnot. He also debuffs enemies, making them take increased damage, and lastly, his weapon also builds up blood loss, so you could proc a bleed build up much faster with his help, getting your buffs going, and doing a lot of damage faster. He's kind of perfect for this. Again, not needed, but recommended for how useful he is. Alright, last thing on here is the stats. This is a level 150 build, but I'll tell you what to really focus on first when it comes to leveling up from the start. The first thing is obviously health. I reached 50 because I found that to be the perfect amount where I didn't feel vulnerable, or like I was going to die from 1 to 2 hits. Level this up as you see fit. If you're really good at the game and don't take many hits, I wouldn't focus too heavily on this from the start, but if you're not, you might want to level this one up the most from the beginning. Next is Mind. I got 33 with the incantations costing so much. This just allows me to spam them a lot more frequently without having to constantly stop and drink from the mana flask. You should focus on this near the end of the build, when you have both the incantations, and they're both doing good amounts of damage. The dexterity stat, you only need 10 to be able to wield the Iron Greatsword. If you're using another sword, the stat may vary, so just go based on what weapon you have, and this will be one of the first things you level up, cause you need a weapon right away. Strength is the same thing, just leveling it up for the requirements of the weapon to use, so again, level up first, and if you don't care about being over-leveled, you could actually come back to this once you level everything else up, and further increase the physical damage on the sword. So you'll then have a crazy strong weapon doing tons of physical damage, and proccing bleed build-ups simultaneously. This build only gets better and better. Intelligence, don't even touch, not needed at all, same thing with Arcane. And again, if you don't care about being over-leveled, you could level up Arcane at the very end and increase the amount of bleed build-up your sword has, making you proc bleed build-ups with less hits, and I think it also increases the damage of the blood loss. Not 100% on that, just something I've heard here and there, but not important. And lastly, Faith, this is going to be our highest stat at 80, the max level before you start seeing little benefits to putting more levels into it, so don't go past it. This is to increase the incantation's damage, and you should probably focus on this after you get the incantations. Almost forgot about endurance. 19 is the perfect amount with the Great Jar's Arsenal, being able to fast roll with all of the armor and weapons equipped. So when it comes to priority, firstly, strength, dexterity and vigor. Secondly, endurance and faith. And lastly, mind. If you want to copy my build exactly stat-wise, you'll need to start off with the Prophet class. If you're using any other starting class, you may have to over-level your character a bit, or sacrifice a few levels from some other stats to make it work. I hope this video helped ya. See ya.